Welcome to the 13th Annual Women in the Law Conference.
Thank you.
And it's such a joy and honor to have you here. I know you've had a little history with Northeastern.
Yes,
You were
indeed.
actually our class of 1992 graduation speaker for the law school. So if you're a 92 grad, you will remember that. But we love our connection. It's my true honor to have you with us today. The word trailblazer is tossed around a lot, but in this case, it's 100% true. And I've wanted you to speak with us for maybe about 5 years, and I was persistent, and maybe the virtual world made this happen. I know you're usually busy with a lot of cases at this time, but I think that I finally wore you down. I don't know if you got to see my mug, Nina,
Thank you.
but I've been drinking out of that all week. This is truly a career highlight, so I'm so happy to have you here. I'm going to dive into your bio for just a minute or two because there's lots to say about that. And then we'll dive into some fun questions. And I look forward to our conversation. Nina is NPR's award-winning legal affairs correspondent, and her reports air regularly on NPR's critically acclaimed news magazines, such as All Things Considered, Morning Edition, and Weekend Edition. Her coverage of the Supreme Court and legal affairs has won her widespread recognition. She's long been an advocate for women, and I'm going to ask her about that in a little bit. In 1991, her groundbreaking report about the University of Oklahoma law professor Anita Hill's allegations of sexual harassment by Judge Clarence Thomas led the Senate Judiciary Committee to reopen Thomas's Supreme Court confirmation hearings and to consider her charges. Her accolades are too numerous to mention them all, but here's a few. She was named the Broadcaster of the Year and honored with the 1998 Saul Tyshoff Award for Excellence in Broadcasting from the National Press Foundation. She is the first radio journalist to receive that award. She is also the recipient of the American Judicature Society's first ever award honoring a career body of work in the field of journalism and the law. Wow. In 1998, she won the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Silver Baton for her coverage of the Supreme Court nominations. She's a frequent contributor on TV shows. She's also written for major newspapers and periodicals, among them the New York Times Magazine, the Harvard Law Review, the Christian Science Month, New York Magazine. So there you have it. There's a lot about Nina. So we're going to dive in. In your early years, you grew up in Manhattan. I read that you loved Nancy Drew. Who didn't? Mm-hmm. And you still actually do detective work in a way. So in a way, I think that's wonderful. You were involved in a production of The Diary of Anne Frank, which starred your classmate, who was Liza Minnelli. And I know your journalism career started in Boston, our own town. You worked for the Boston Record American and then the Peabody Times before you moved to DC. So that's just a little bit more about Nina's personal connections to our city and a little bit of history. I want to ask you a little bit about your dad. Your dad was a Holocaust survivor. His name is Roman Totenberg, and a world-renowned violinist. How do you think your father shaped who you are today?
Well, technically he wasn't a Holocaust survivor because he got out before the Holocaust began. He got out in 1938, but his family all remained behind, and despite his very valiant efforts to get everybody out, he didn't get anybody out, and most of them perished in the war. His brother-in-law died in the Warsaw Ghetto. His sister somehow my dad had taken some steps, and somehow she escaped the Warsaw Ghetto with her then about 5-year-old daughter, who now is my 80-something-year-old cousin who lives in this country. But her mother really never left Warsaw because she came to the United States right after the war for a very short time and then returned because while she was hiding out, she was befriended by the man and had fallen in love with this man who hid her a great deal of the time. And she married him, and they had a life in Warsaw during the years of the Iron Curtain, and it was very difficult. But they stayed there. That's where their life was, and they came to the United States for longer and longer stays and visits with their daughter, but essentially their life remained in Poland.
Wow. He had an amazing life and did what he could to help his
Mhm.
family.
Those were very dark years for him, the war years. I mean, I think they were saved, he was saved really by meeting my mother, who was the light of his life, not just the love of his life, but the light of his
Oh,
life, and managed to get him through that period and to bring some new joie de vivre when he was really um, in a gray mood, I guess is the only way you could say it, a dark mood.
sure. So she sounds phenomenal too. I read a little bit about her. Can you talk about your mom a little bit?
Well, my mother was quite a pistol. She had worked in the New Deal, doing a lot of political work. She was a big FDR supporter and cried when he died. I remember her telling me. And of natural causes, he died. This was not some awful, the kind of awful thing that we have faced in the modern era. He died of natural causes, and she wept.
Wow.
Um, as many people in the United States did at that period of time. And she was primarily, in the beginning of when she first met my father, she was somebody's executive assistant. And then when she started to have children, she just took care of us. And I think it almost killed her, frankly, before she finally realized that she had to work in addition to raising us. And she became a real estate broker, and a great real estate broker for residential homes.
Fantastic. She's amazing. Now, your dad had some obviously amazing musical talent. Do you have musical talent? Did it skip a generation like it did in my family?
No, I have musical talent, but when you're the daughter of somebody who is really pretty close to a genius in some ways, you understand that you have to be totally devoted to that craft. I mean, he practiced hours a day. He spent hours going over scores, and he was on the road a great deal of the time.
Yeah.
But did not let that diminish what a great dad he was. He was a really sweet man for a person who was a virtuoso performer. They often are not so sweet, but he was. And I just understood that I needed to do something different than that. I have a really good singing voice. I have an instinct for music, and it moves me, but that was not what I wanted to do.
Got it. If you weren't a journalist, what field do you think you might have gone into? I'm sure you get that question a lot, but did you think about being an attorney at all? You have that
I
bent with the
didn't.
Supreme Court.
I think that didn't occur to me, mainly because there were so few women attorneys, just the way there were so few women reporters. So you really had to pick one thing you were going to do, and I really didn't like school very much. So the idea of being in school for another 3 years was more than I could bear. And in fact, I left school before I graduated. I just decided I was going to go out and try to be a reporter, and I seem to have done okay.
You definitely have done okay. I'm going to touch on that next. You are a true trailblazer in the field of journalism, and there's a book chronicling the early years of NPR that's recently been published. It's called Susan, Linda, Nina, and Koki, The Extraordinary Story of the Founding Mothers of NPR. So if you all haven't read it, I highly recommend it. I got a lot of good backstories on Nina. It's by Lisa Napoli, and here's a quote. They changed journalism, the public's perception of women, and while they were at it, women's perceptions of themselves. There were a lot of deep quotes in this book, but that one really resonated. Can you describe, now I know not everybody's read it, but can you give us sort of an expansive talk a little bit about your early years at NPR and what those were like, the flavors?
Well, let me give a lot of credit here to Lisa Napoli, who interviewed me for about an hour, and I think she did the same with the other three because Kofi was still alive when she was working in the book. And but then the lockdown came, and she wrote this book in 18 months.
Wow.
And I gave her almost no help, except that I did an hour-long interview, and I think I remember dimly a short follow-up interview. And so she did this really pretty much on her own. And it is a story not just of women, but of broadcasting and how NPR and the women of NPR changed broadcasting forever, I think, in many ways. And so I want to give her all the credit in the world for writing that kind of a book. But I do think that we were great supports for one another. And especially Koki, Linda, and me, because we sat in one corner of the newsroom. Susan was our dear friend, but she was one floor down. Koki's desk was literally jammed up against mine. I got her hired at NPR. Then Koki realized that, or I took the steps to get her hired, let's put it that way. It was the beginning of the Old Girls Network. And then Linda realized that she'd been in college with Koki. And she had known her in college. I hadn't known her. Her husband called me up, cold called me and said, they were back from Greece where he'd been stationed for the New York Times. And he said, I understand there might be a job at NPR, and my wife has been a stringer for CBS Radio. And I said, just come on over and bring me her resume. And I took it to the news director, plunked it on his desk and said, pay attention. So
Pay attention now, yes.
But we were so close, and we were so eventually so powerful within the very small network that we were then. I mean, NPR is now, the building that we worked in Washington when we were there was like 950 people. We were not more than, I think, 75 people at the time, and only a third of that was probably, maybe 30 or 40 of that was the news division. So I think that we really were a very powerful group of women in that very small beginning, so much so that one of the guys jokingly referred to us, and I'd like to think fondly referred to us as fallopian jungle. Where we sat was the fallopian jungle.
The fallopian jungle.
Yes, and we were, I have to say, we were only half amused, but we weren't really insulted. You could never do that today and get away with it. You would be up on charges. But at the time, it was in its own way a tip of the hat to the fact that you didn't mess with us, and I could use a different word than mess.
You could here. No, the book gives a lot of backstories. That was beautiful. I love that you all sat by each other. Koki was phenomenal too, and actually all four. But I love that you helped hire her. That's part of what we're about here is the Old Girls Network or the New Girls Network. That's really what we believe in with this conference. So it's great that you all helped each other. Did you have an early mentor, either male or female, or would you call the four of you each other's mentors?
I think we were each other's mentors. We really were each other's mentors. There were people I looked up to in the journalism world, and there were even people at NPR like Frank Mankiewicz, when he came in as president of NPR, did an enormous amount for the network, really put it on the map. And I enjoyed him, and he was a friend, but they were not the same kind of mentors and friends that my women friends were at NPR. And I was really interested in one of the reviews of Lisa Napoli's book. There was a paragraph near the end. It may even have been the New York Times review or the Post review. And it said, one thing that's sort of wrong with this book is that it's all positive, and they seem to want, and the inference is that there must have been catfights going on, and that they just never tell. And that's just not true. It really, we never had those kinds of arguments. We sometimes had arguments about things we were covering,
Right.
on the merits, so to speak. But they weren't serious arguments. I mean, most of the time, I think we had a similar approach to covering the news. And, I would even say something like this. I'd say to Koki, I can't figure out how to get all of this in one story. And she would say something. She would say, well, why don't you do it in two? Or, one of us would come in. I remember one time I came in and I said, I don't know why Floyd has been so mean to me. That was my late husband. Has been so mean to me for the last couple of days. And she said, are you going away? And I said, oh yeah, I'm going away for 5 days. Okay, that's why he's being mean to me. He's mad that I'm leaving him in the lurch, right?
Yes. Yeah, sometimes that we get that passive aggressive energy from those that love us the best and we figure it out later, but women can help us kind of uncover that. After I read Lisa's book, I found myself hoping that you might write a memoir. Might you at some point?
I have sort of, I may be doing it, but I can't devote the kind of time to it that I would like. And so I'm still sort of noodling about it.
Toying.
Mhm.
Well, let me tell you, it would be a hit. So we'd love to hear some of the inner workings and your perspective on that. If you were talking to your 25-year-old self, we have people of all age ranges, lawyers of all age ranges on here, from students to CEOs, the highest range in their career. What would you tell your 25-year-old self in terms of career advice? And would you do anything differently?
Oh yeah, I do some things differently. You remember that I was almost the only one on my beat everywhere I went, or one of two, in every job, in every venue, in every story I was covering. And although I presented, apparently, based on Lisa Napoli's book, I presented the picture of a completely sassy and completely self-confident young woman. I wasn't. I was completely insecure. And therefore, I really thought that I had to be very aggressive about getting people to pay attention to me, to deal with me, and to believe that I was, if not somebody important, somebody that it would be more painful if they just didn't just talk to me. Or I would bat my eyelashes at them and let them say stupid things and then go right them down, that kind of thing. But mainly I would say to myself, take it down a peg or two. You don't have to be that aggressive. You don't have to complain about everything. Pick your battles. I did understand to pick my battles. I did really absorb that. But I do think that I could have been a lot more diplomatic and not alienated people quite so much, and not presented in a way that even I read in Lisa's book and I find sort of unappealing on occasion. Now, maybe I'm oversensitive about it, but I would I would say that to myself, and I would probably say it to this generation of women too. You don't have to be a pill all the time.
Maybe you had to be in that era, you know?
I think I had to be a pill some of the time, but
Yeah.
not, or at least very feisty. But I do think that often you can get as much with sugar as you can with bitters.
Got it. I would love to hear your perspective on feminism. Have you ever marched in a women's march? Do you think we're going to get to
No.
the ERA?
I have marched, but because I've always covered those things, I felt I couldn't do it.
You
And
did.
the only time I ever was a participant was when I joined the picketers outside the Gridiron Club when they didn't admit women. The Gridiron Club was, at that time anyway, the leading annual press bash, and it had usually all the members of the cabinet, many of the members of the Supreme Court, the leadership of Congress, the president sometimes, and they put on a big skit that they practiced for ages. And I'm a good singer. I could have been in the Gridiron Club, but nobody invited me, and they didn't admit women, period. They were not guests, and they were not members. And so the Women's Press Club, because we weren't at that point admitted to the press club either, decided to have a counter gridiron. And it became so popular, it was, I think, the first or second year that we did it, that everybody wanted to go to ours and not theirs. And that really broke the back of the ban on women. But just before that, the year before that, and before I headed over to the women's, the counter gridiron, I was outside I think it was the Hilton Hotel, screaming at people as they were going in. And I remember Justice Thurgood Marshall got out of a court car, and I yelled, Shame on you, shame.
Wow. Holding them to the fire. I loved it. Well, I mean, in my mind, you are a feminist. Maybe you
Well,
could
I
have.
am a feminist.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
am a feminist, but I am very careful
Yeah.
about this, to the point that after my husband Floyd Haskell died and I remarried, my husband said he'd been given tickets for an Annie DeFranco concert and that we were going to go. And I said, "How did you get tickets?" And he said, "Well, it's a benefit." And I said, "Who is it a benefit for?" And he said, "It's for," I don't remember which one, but a pro-choice group. And I said, "Well, then you're going by yourself because I can't go."
Yep. You have to make choices. Yep. Next, I want to dive into a little bit about RBG. You've probably been asked some of these questions previously, but you had a 50-year friendship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Those are treasured friendships in life. We talked about this a little bit earlier in our conference day. You saw each other through illness and loss. Um, I know many people have probably heard the story, but I want to hear about how you first met her. And did you immediately know you were kindred spirits? And why do we love her so much?
Let me take the last first. I mean, I'm not quite sure why she became such an icon in her 80s. Because as I think back about it, maybe in her very late 70s, it started. But it really wasn't till I think 2015 that the meme, the notorious RBG, came into being. And and before that, her fame had grown, but it wasn't quite this. It really wasn't until she was um, in her late 70s, early 80s, till that started. She was by far the most famous person on the Supreme Court, far more famous than the Chief Justice. I'm not sure that all the other justices loved it that way. As long as Sandra Day O'Connor was alive, so was O'Connor that kind of an icon. But when she left the court in 2005, um, that subsided. She was no longer as much a public figure as she had been. And there was something about uh, Ruth that was just, even though she was a very quiet, soft spoken, and shy person, she conveyed this incredible strength of conviction, whether you agreed with her or not. And I didn't always agree with her. She understood that. I understood that. But whether you agreed with her or not, there was something so fearless about this little quiet person that it was sort of a remarkable contrast within one body.
Yeah. So we heard a little bit about her in the fall, like we mentioned. We had the author of Notorious RBG, who also adored her. Um, do you think she knew what her lasting legacy would be? Do you think she took that in while she was still with us?
Oh, I think she definitely did. She had all her marbles. She was still working, even from the hospital in the final months of her life. Uh, she didn't die in the hospital. She would make quick trips to the hospital when things would get out of control. But I, she was in the last year of her life. Once the lockdown was started, she had dinner with us every Saturday night. And my husband cooked for her because there was no place else that was safe for her to go. And he's the doctor he wasn't her doctor, but he had advised her a lot over the years. And so she knew she was safe. And she would leave our dinner table and go home and work. And only really in the last 2, 3 weeks of her life was I absolutely sure that she wasn't going to make it.
She was very resilient and she kept coming back from things that would amaze. This tiny little person was so strong. She really did impact us. Can you talk a little bit about how women's friendships have sustained you? You had such close ones both at work and with RBG.
Well, I Ruth had the bad form to die a year and a day after Kobe did. So it was a really double blow. And I don't like to think about it. Let's put it that way. They
Yeah.
were my two of my very closest friends. I said to one of my other, we all have only a handful of those kinds of friends that are incredibly close. And I said to one of my other friends the other day, I said, now look, you're not allowed to die. She's younger than I am. She's about 6 or 7 years younger than I am. I said, look, you're not allowed to die. And she said, you've told me that before.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got that one. Yeah, we're very sorry for your loss. I know it was a deep, deep friendship. So I wanted to just tell you that. Can you just talk about the first time you called her up out of the blue?
Well, it was out of the blue, but it wasn't out of the blue. So I was a really young reporter. I was in my early 20s. I've been assigned to cover the Supreme Court for the National Observer, in addition to many other things. But that was the one thing they said I was supposed to devote at least constant time to. And I really didn't know anything. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know much about the law. I knew something about covering local trials because I covered a bunch of them, but beyond that, I knew nothing about constitutional law, statutory law. I knew nothing. And so I, spent a lot of time reading briefs and stuff like that. And the first, I think it was like I've been doing this for a couple of years, maybe. And nobody covered the court really the way a lot of people cover it today, like a blanket. Even Tony Lewis from the New York Times and Fred Graham, who had succeeded him, covered many other things. They covered the Justice Department, as did I. They covered scandals. They covered special prosecutors, as did I. So we had a much broader agenda in a way because we didn't have a million platforms. We were filing for one paper or one TV network and one TV show or radio, ultimately a radio show. Even when I went to work for NPR, there was one radio show, news radio show, and it wasn't even as long as it is today. It was an hour and a half version of All Things Considered. And so you could cover a broad array of other subjects and not have to do digital, have to do social media, have to do multiple programs in the day. I mean, a midday show, a morning show, an evening show, a special, a this, a that. So anyway, there I am sitting in the press room and I'm reading this brief in the case that ultimately became Reed versus Reed, which ultimately became the first case in which the Supreme Court said that the 14th Amendment protects the equal rights of women as well as African Americans and other racial minorities. So, but as I'm reading this, as I said, don't know blankety blank from Shinola and squat from Shinola, let's just say, and I didn't understand it. I mean, the 14th Amendment was enacted to protect African American and formerly enslaved people. And so I flipped the front of the brief, and it was written by a law professor at Rutgers named Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and it had her telephone number there. And I went into the phone booth, because we had phone booths in those days, and I called her up and I got an hour-long lecture. And the next time I started calling her regularly, and then eventually we met at some conference in New York. I don't remember what the conference was. She always thought it was one thing and I thought it was another, but it doesn't really matter because it was so boring that we left and went shopping.
That's how it started.
Yep.
One phone call. Is there one Supreme Court story or case over the years that's totally surprised you?
I think there have been many. The most recent one was the ACA case, because the first ACA case, because no matter how you thought it was going to go, absolutely nobody thought it was going to be decided on the tax grounds, which had been rejected by every court that heard it, including those that upheld it. But nobody bought the tax argument, and in the end, the Chief Justice bought the tax argument, and he became the fifth vote. But there were others. There was a point at which the Supreme Court struck down the death penalty as cruel and unusual punishment, or as the court put it at the time, as wantonly freakish as being struck by lightning. And I absolutely never expected that to happen, nor did I expect them to then reverse themselves more or less when some states began making some modest adjustments, like bifurcating the trial with a guilt and a punishment stage and that kind of thing. So I wasn't too shocked about Roe versus Wade because they've been it was one of the few times they've been a leak at the court. I think there are maybe 3 of those in the many decades that I've covered the court. There might have been 3 of those. So you never know if it's really going to turn out to be true. And especially if I have to say that I would be terrified to report on the outcome of the case before it was decided, because I know of too many such cases that have changed over the course of the internal debate.
Have flipped. Yeah, we have some big cases coming up that hold a lot of interest, and certainly this week that made news. Any particular career goal that you would still love to accomplish?
Well, I'd like to have a podcast of my own, but I'd have to have an awful lot of help to do it because it's yet another thing that you have to do. So I'm very glad that NPR is including me more in the politics podcast. And in fact, we had episode 1 of one called The Docket, which is about legal things, but we haven't had subsequent versions of that, though I've been on the podcast in subsequent weeks. But it takes a lot of effort to put together a good podcast. And you really need to, you can't just throw it up there. I think a lot of people think that making a podcast is easy and that everybody will be really interested in what they have to say. But that actually isn't true. You have to make it entertaining. And I have to say, you have to make it youthful. And by youthful, I mean, I wouldn't rely on me to do that, as to be the producer. Not that I couldn't make it interesting, but there are all kinds of things that podcasts do that I find very odd to the ear, like having kind of weird music in the background, here and there. Or it's just, I wouldn't call myself an old broad, but I am not in my 20s or early 30s. And this is one of the ways that I have to educate myself, just the way I had to learn to tweet.
We would love a podcast and a memoir. So if you could add those to
You
your
want both
list,
at the same time, right?
you could add those to your list. Okay, I have a question, and then we're going to do a lightning round. One last question. Do you have a mission statement or a creed that you live your life by?
No.
Nothing.
No, get it right and get it fast.
Ooh, I like that. That's good. All right, are you ready for a lightning round?
I'm ready for a lightning round.
Favorite musician?
Roman Totenberg.
Oh, of course. Favorite movie?
I'm not sure I have a favorite, but one of my favorites is Moonstruck.
Okay. Favorite current TV program?
I like talk shows. So there's one I watched on both Amazon and Netflix. It's old. It's actually old and British. So it's called Touch of Frost. I really like it.
Great. Favorite female actor? We could come back to it too.
What's her name? Let me just see in a moment. The devil.
Meryl Streep?
Yeah, Meryl Streep.
Meryl Streep. All right.
Meryl Streep, because she can do so many different roles so well, and she's not a chickie.
Favorite author?
Well, I actually love Agatha Christie, but I long ago read all of those. And I love really good biographies.
Me too. Me too.
So I have to say that there's a biography of John Marshall by an author named Jean Edward Smith, which is one of my favorites of all time. And there are some other wonderful biographies. I mean, the biography of Doris Prince Goodwin biography of Franklin and Eleanor. No Ordinary Times is a wonderful biographical book. And
phenomenal writer.
Yeah.
Last book you read. Do you have time?
Some trashy mystery. That's what I read at night to go to sleep.
It works. Favorite current Supreme, and not Diana Ross.
You mean a justice? Is that what you mean?
All right.
I think I best not answer that.
I thought I'd try. Well, those are the questions I have. I want to see if any of our audience would like to ask you a question. If you want to put it in the chat or raise your hand. Nina, it's such a joy to have you with us. You have no idea how many fans you have here at Northeastern Law. We're a social justice law school that fights for the good, and you are one of those people. You've been doing it through journalism for years, so we're just so pleased to have you with us.
Oh, it's really a pleasure to be with you. So I can't see if you hear chat questions.
All right, Amy, you're going to help me. Does anybody have a question?
Maybe it's here.
I don't see anything in the chat.
Does anyone want to unmute themselves and be brave?
Come on, don't be intimidated by Nina
No, come on.
Totenberg. Now's your time.
Oh, okay. Here's one from Jami. Do you want to unmute yourself?
I think her question is, what younger journalists do you respect and suggest that we read?
Good question.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I was muted. I adore you. You're beyond iconic. Thank you for talking with us.
Well, she's younger than I am by a fair amount, but she's not young, but in the way that I think you mean. So Jane Mayer, who writes for the New Yorker now, is a wonderful reporter, just a wonderful reporter. And I think that almost everything that she writes about is interesting. And if it wasn't interesting when you started, it's interesting by the time you're done. You know, because of the pandemic, I have to say that I haven't seen another reporter in the flesh at an event that I'm covering in a year and a half. So I don't even know who some of the younger, I may read a byline, but I don't know how old they are. I mean, Carrie Johnson at NPR, who covers the Justice Department, is a wonderful reporter. I was listening to a piece that on NPR that Asma Khalid did this morning about the politics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it was just a fabulous piece. She's a wonderful reporter, just a wonderful reporter.
We have another question from Sarah. Sarah, do you want to unmute yourself?
Wait a minute. I'm sorry. I didn't realize my camera was off and my video was off. Okay, here we are. Ms. Totenberg, I have to say I've admired you for so many years. I'm so grateful that you came to talk to us. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
My question is, do you have any advice for young journalists who are starting out today?
Well, I mean, I'm assuming that here you mean largely women journalists.
Sure.
So the lessons that I talked about earlier about taming the natural aggressions, I still think are not bad. They may not want to hear that, but they will look back like I do someday. My own.
Somehow I got them muted. This computer does not work very well.
Behavior and think, I wish I'd been a little more diplomatic. And then the thing I tell people always is, you know, there are a lot more venues to become a journalist, but it's really hard work. harder than it used to be. There is no lid most days. You just keep going all day into the night. And that's the reason I think that there are lots more places to be a journalist, online, on podcasts, on the radio, whatever. But it is hard work, and harder than it was when I began. It was harder for me because I was a woman, but the work itself is harder now because it's just so all consuming. It's a little easier since Donald Trump left because you could never know. I mean, I remember finishing a piece one day and walking upstairs and saying, should I plan a morning piece or not? And my editor said to me, well, just wait an hour because Trump's coming off the golf course and he'll tweet about what you just wrote about, and then we'll have to change it. So it just never stops. And my hat goes off to especially younger women like Tamara Keith, for example, one of our White House correspondents, who have families and are doing that full time at the same time that they are doing a job that never ceases. You know, when I was a younger reporter, and not even up until I would say probably the last vice presidential campaign that I covered was in 2008, I think. And by then already it was changing a lot. By the 2000s, the idea that you could actually finish for the day and have dinner with your press buddies on a campaign trail was gone because you had to be filing more for the next day, for digital, for maybe doing an interview for TV if you were a newspaper person. There was nobody to go out with. If I was doing it I remember that last campaign was the Biden campaign, and I was not doing a daily story. I was doing a feature about Cheney, not about Cheney, but about the vice presidential candidates. So it was Sarah Palin and Joe Biden. And of course, the Palin campaign was in total chaos and there was no access to her whatsoever. So forget that. I went out for several days and I did a story. And then I went out with Biden and I got a 20, 25-minute interview and I went around. But I was not, unless he'd made news, which he didn't, I was not filing every day. So I looked around for somebody to have a drink with when the day was over, when he did his last event at 9:30 at night. And there wasn't anybody. Everybody was filing, still filing, and going to be filing. So the world has changed for journalists dramatically.
We have a question from Cookie Adams. I felt like we should ask it because her name was Cookie. What is your secret for staying neutral in highly partisan times?
Well, you can't always stay neutral in your own head, but you can try to stay neutral in public. My secret is, if you didn't want what you said to be on the front page of the New York Times, you shouldn't say it. If it is, it would be embarrassing to you, that one sentence or that paragraph, and somebody took it out in isolation and put it on the front page of the New York Times and put it in your mouth, then you shouldn't say it. Now, I did a TV program where I was the girl for 21 years. And in the beginning, I made some mistakes. I forgot that maxim. And it was a couple of times very embarrassing, but I learned to think before I spoke. And it served me very well.
Thank you. Thanks so much for answering the question. And I am greatly honored to carry Koki's name.
There you are.
Karen O'Malley, did you want to ask a question? She might.
Yes, hi. No, I'm so starstruck. I'm having a hard time asking my question. Thank you for being with us and for inspiring us all these years. I was wondering if you have ever been starstruck by anyone you've either reported on or interviewed.
Well, I interviewed President Obama once, and it was very much a last minute thing. It was when the Garland nomination was hanging by a thread, and I get a call from the press secretary saying, would you like to interview President Obama tomorrow? And I said, well, I have to check with my boss because we have a policy that you can't let the White House pick the interviewer. So, but this was a natural. I understood this was supposed to be about the situation we were in, and he was in, and I had met him before in the Senate, but I had not been over at the White House except for I think a Christmas party or something like that. And so the next day I went. We actually had a TV crew so that we could put it online as a TV interview, which was lucky because he was a terrible radio interview because we had a policy at the time that you couldn't cut the president. You couldn't internally cut the president. So if he said, I'm going to the store, I'm going to buy a gun, and after that I'm going to shoot somebody, you couldn't leave out the I'm going to buy a gun. So, and he had these, they weren't just pauses you could take out, but he had this, thing he did, and he'd have a word in there and we weren't allowed to take it out. So I chopped up that interview. It was like a 35-minute interview, but I chopped up that interview really hard to get everything in it, but I didn't think it was very good, frankly. However, I was so starstruck in the beginning that I forgot to turn my phone off, and it rang during the middle of the interview. And he and I said simultaneously, I said, geez, I thought I was a professional. He said, geez, I thought you were supposed to be a professional. But obviously he enjoyed the interview because it was supposed to be 15 minutes and it was at least double that.
I'd be
And
starting.
by the way, I don't know about now, but then he was definitely the most beautiful man I'd ever been in the presence of, including George Clooney. Way more beautiful than George.
Oh, I don't know. No, he's fantastic. Wow, that's a good one to be starstruck by. Do you have time for one more question, Nina?
Sure.
So Courtney Philly Carp, are you still with us? And can you unmute?
Yes, I'm here. I'm just plugged in because my iPad's dying. Just to share everyone else's sentiments, also starstruck. I was saying when the interview started, it was so weird to be able to see your voice while hearing your voice, which I know so well. I mean, to see your face while hearing your voice, which I know so well. On a bigger, longer term perspective, I think for those of us who try to use social media for good, although feel like mostly it's not so much, what do you think the long-term impacts, and not the easy sort of Donald Trump effect, but what are the long-term impacts about a medium that is the exact opposite of investigative journalism on our political discourse? And where do you see this going in the future, as not just with journalism, but with the political conversation?
Well, it's a little scary, I think, to have a country where a substantial number of people don't believe facts. They don't believe that Biden actually won the election. They think the election was stolen, even though in their states, very often, Democrats lost seats, which is really hard to say. How can you say that the vote that was cast by Nina Totenberg, let's say, that Joe Biden ends up with X number of votes more than Donald Trump, but that the senator in that state or the congressman in the key district who's a Democrat loses? That doesn't track. It doesn't make sense. Or to be less political about it, people don't want to be vaccinated, and they will accept any sort of fiction rather than most of the scientists in the country, and the fact that Donald Trump has been vaccinated, and the former vice president has been vaccinated, and I think I'm quite sure that Mitch McConnell was vaccinated because he had polio as a child. He knows the importance of having a vaccine. So the fact that some members of the House or the Senate are willing to put their colleagues in jeopardy by not wearing a mask when they haven't been vaccinated is really, I I don't understand it. And I think that that is that whole issue of some basic facts. If you don't have some agreed on facts, you can't run a country. And I don't care who's trying to run it. I don't care if it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden. I do think that if you don't have some agreed upon facts, the whole democratic process of voting is in jeopardy. Even the possibilities of having a declaration of war is in jeopardy. We have to find a way to agree on facts, or we will have a shredded democracy. We can't agree on many things, I'm sure, but some basic givens that most responsible people agree on is essential to a democracy. And it's why I think that journalism is really important. And it's why that I think that I saw today that Axios is going to start local news organizations in 6 places in the country. We have very little left of local news in this country. And that means, and that's the closest place to home. So that is the area where you can actually see accountability work and where people begin to trust us more.
Well, thank you for being a trusted source all these years, Nina, and for having us tune into the radio, support NPR in any way you can. Keep it going.
Thank you.
We had a couple scary moments there. If everyone would please unmute yourselves. We need a huge round of applause for Nina for being a part of Women in the Law 2021.
Thank you so much for having me.
Really was an honor.
Amazing. Thank you.
We love you. We
Love
admire
you.
you.
We love Nina
Thank
Totenberg.
you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye,
Thank
Nina
you.
Totenberg.
To your
Be
podcast.
well.
Thank you.
Can't wait for your memoir.
Yes,
Thank you.
we're the podcast.
Add the podcast. Yes, the podcast. My dog wants it.
Bye.
Bye, Nina. Thank you.